joining us for this conversation about Zero Trust adoption best practices. I'm Lisa Lorenzen. I'm a field CTO with the Americas. I've been with Zscaler about 5 years, and I'm focused on our Zero Trust solutions.
Thanks, Lisa. Great to be here with you. My name is Brian Green. I am a security practitioner. I've been in the field for about 25 years. I come with an engineering and architecture background in network and cloud security, and I've been with Zscaler for about 5 months.
It's always nice to talk with you, Brian. So take us through what we're going to discuss today.
Sure. So on the agenda today, we have a lot to talk about. We are going to talk through what Zero Trust is, how it is difficult to get there, and the majority of the conversation today is really going to center around the journey, the various approaches to Zero Trust and Zero Trust adoption.
Sounds good. So let's start by setting a baseline. In the NIST guidance that came out last year, NIST 800-207, they outlined a Zero Trust architecture that's based on some common components: policy decision, policy enforcement, the ability to bring in various elements like identity and device context. If we look at this at a high level, it really breaks down to what can we understand about the user. Zero trust is just shorthand for zero implicit trust. We need to establish trust. And the way that we establish trust is by gathering context and then comparing that against a baseline. So the first step is to intercept the traffic, terminate the connection attempt, decrypt if necessary, identify who's requesting, and then come in and verify the user. Is the device managed or unmanaged? Is it compliant with requirements? Are there other risks or security considerations that need to be taken into consideration? All of this goes into the establishment of a context-based least privilege access connection. So access is only granted once the user has passed all of these gates, and we're not taking the legacy approach of connecting an endpoint to a network. Instead, we're connecting a user directly to an authorized application. If we break this down a little farther, it looks a lot like things you already have in your environment today. We're not starting from scratch. You might have endpoint security and protection components, identity and access management, backend SIEM and SOAR for logging, monitoring, and orchestration. The Zscaler Zero Trust Exchange slots into your existing security ecosystem. Our service edges provide the policy engine and policy decision, as well as policy enforcement. We have the ability to deliver traffic to applications both in the data center, private applications in a public cloud, even private data in a software as a service environment, while protecting users from open internet and potentially malicious external resources. We tie into your existing identity and access management to start off by determining who the user is, and that can tie us to a number of other context clues. Once we have this context, we have the ability to create dynamic encrypted connections between the user and the requested resource. We can tie in additional protections for sensitive data, as well as context and compliance information about the endpoint, either directly through the client connector or from existing security controls. We can leverage threat intelligence from our own threat labs, as well as third-party threat feeds. And we tie in a number of different compliance elements for the back-end resources themselves, the cloud environments, with cloud security posture management, cloud infrastructure entitlement management, some of these new fields that have sprung up as applications have moved to cloud environments. We tie that back to your SIEM so that you have full visibility. And then that can also tie into a SOAR environment for orchestration, automation, and the ability to make as much of this run on Rails as possible. So once we have this ideal solution defined, the question is, how do we get there? Brian, what are some of the challenges in getting here?
Thanks, Lisa. So thank you for the walkthrough of NIST 800-207. It's great. I think we all really appreciate the guidance from NIST and their direction, but we also recognize that it's complex. And NIST 207 is not exactly a how-to manual. It is not a paint by colors. It's not a step-by-step instructional. So our goal today is really to understand how we can translate NIST 207 and Zero Trust methodologies into actionable best practices. So how can practitioners in the field adopt these things? So what we're going to attempt to do today is to answer difficult questions. So for example, how do we pivot to Zero Trust from legacy-based architectures? Where do you begin? How do you start this journey? What are some of the best practices for adoption? And importantly, how do you get stakeholder buy-in? How do you get consensus within your current organization, within your current leadership team, within your stakeholders? We also get into understanding what is the appropriate level of board visibility? How do you get executive buy-in? How do you get executive support for these initiatives? And lastly, we'll close with common misconceptions and pitfalls, things you should avoid in your zero trust journey. So Lisa, could you share a couple of the high-level takeaways for today's session?
Absolutely. We can give you the TLDR up front. There's 3 key takeaways today, and the first one is
bias towards action. So you're on fire, effectively. The threat landscape continues to change with cloud, cloud migrations, the adoption of public cloud services, and obviously what is happening in the world with working from home and working remotely.
So how do we tackle that? Take the first step. Figure out where you can buy down risk, or at a minimum, solve a painful business problem, whether that's performance, cost, or legacy technology incurring technical debt. Once we do that,
then once we tackle that, expand strategically. So recognizing that zero trust is not a monolithic effort. There are many caveats, many pieces to this puzzle, and that this is a journey, and practitioners really need to plan accordingly.
Definitely.
So let's start with the first item. So bias toward action. Lisa, what has worked for you?
My biggest problem in most environments is overthinking, overanalyzing. It's definitely worth taking the time to consider a first step, but at some point you have to stop thinking and start doing. The goal is to get some relatively low-hanging fruit wins while you figure out the larger strategy. Zero trust can be overwhelming. There's so many vendors touting it. There's so many white papers from analysts to government guidance. So how do we find the low-hanging fruit? We look for a pain point. Common entry points for zero trust are identifying a security risk. That might be an exposed attack surface, it might be overprivileged access, or third-party access. Another adjacent area is poor user experience, whether that's due to backhaul, latency, or just the complexity of the security stack itself. And a third enormous area is cost. Could be the implicit cost of technical debt, expensive network infrastructure, ongoing connectivity costs. But my goal is always to start small, and that way we can ensure success early in the process and build credibility for tackling some of the harder problems. Brian, how did this play out for you?
Yeah, for me, bias towards action really is exactly, I would say, +1 to the start small. Understand what your risk is. So have some means or some mechanism to really quantify what the risk is in your environment. Start with those very small use cases and socialize those with your larger team. Is this risk, is this the same risk that your executive team, your board of directors is seeing? Is this the same that your engineering team is faced with? Socialize those use cases, really make sure that there is buy-in and really have rigor around some of these outcomes. Make sure that you're focused on, make sure that that first step is very sound, is going to actually solve buy down material risk across your organization. And one word of caution I would say is, we all do this, especially with new technology, is avoid scope creep, right? Shiny new things. Zero trust there's a lot of new materials and new capabilities that zero trust is bringing. So, try to avoid doing all the things and trying to solve all of the problems, but be very rigorous around very particular outcomes. The other part I would say is to avoid analysis paralysis. So just getting purposely breaking out of this, needing to boil the ocean and trying to, solve all of the, security problems within your organization, but to really build strong conviction around architecture. Lisa, I'd be curious, how have you seen, customers getting stuck or just getting into sort of this analysis paralysis mode?
Well, I think one of the challenges is believing that you have to get it right on the first try. There is no single right answer for zero trust. It's not monolithic. So what we need is an architecture that's flexible enough to accommodate different levels of maturity, and that will help increase confidence. I think it's a matter of giving yourself permission to experiment and having the confidence to apply differing levels of control and granularity based on the context you have, based on the risk that you're trying to solve for, based on your level of maturity within the zero trust process.
Yeah, I would agree, Lisa. And I think some other cautionary tales would be to not solution by democracy or trying to necessarily crowdsource the solutioning to this. I think it's important to get stakeholder opinion, to look at your risk posture and your risk appetite, frankly, and understand what that looks like. but not trying to solve, by democracy. So certainly socialize those outcomes, build consensus, have constructive feedback, and have a constructive feedback loop so that you can be very clear about things like the ownership model, who is going to own specific parts of those deliverables, ensuring that there is ownership with empowerment. So making sure that the engineering teams, the operations teams, the architecture teams that are deploying and building these solutions have the appropriate resources, have the appropriate capabilities, and the direction and leadership support so that they can be successful in these things. And the last part, I think, to this is program management. So having strong discipline, having good governance around how you manage these large projects, right? These zero trust projects, as we mentioned, are not monolithic, right? It's not just your identity and access management team. It's not just your endpoint security teams. There's a lot of moving parts to zero trust and to get it right. So making sure that you have a clear path on how do you escalate blockers, who are the decision makers, how does your project steerco work, steering committee, versus the folks that are in the project core teams, and making sure that you have really good discipline and rigor around that.
That's key. And I want to call back to something you just said, gaining consensus across the organization, whether it's your stakeholders, your board, or the boots on the ground that actually have to implement this stuff. For a really long time, IT security was seen as the department of no. No, you can't do that. No, I won't open that up. No, we won't connect that connection. And it was really seen as a business inhibitor. The move to zero trust can actually be leveraged to remove brittleness and remove the friction of the mismatch between our traditional network layer controls and user to application needs. And that offers new flexibility so you can accelerate existing initiatives and enable new ones. That could be removing barriers to deploying new functions or features, new applications, and it can even extend to things like increased business intelligence, where the security team is now offering data back to the business owners. So instead of being the department of no, N-O, we can actually empower your IT security team to become the department of no, K-N-O-W. Brian, what was most effective for you in building consensus?
For building consensus for me, I like to approach this as far as rallying stakeholders around a common goal or objective. And I think this is a reference back to what we opened with is, trying to be very thoughtful about the problem that you're trying to solve, right? Getting off on a firm foundation. So starting with the why is this the first, use case that you want to solve with zero trust? And then effectively communicating those changes, how they will reduce risk, or even potentially, what are some of the security or business outcomes that you're really trying to achieve? So I think for me, this is really, goes back to sort of risk management 101 is identifying what are your key risks. Are you tracking key risk drivers? And then ultimately, how do you map those back to your controls? And when I speak of controls, I think Lisa and I will be speaking really about, all the broad spectrum of controls. So people, process, and technology, not just the technical security controls that we love to focus on, but just being very holistic around your approach to this. And then being able to really quantify risk reduction outcomes. So for example, if you're going to implement some sort of zero trust controls, really understand and be very thoughtful about how that control is ultimately buying down risk in your enterprise, be it third-party risk, endpoint security risk, data at rest, data at transit, being very thoughtful about which particular controls are really buying down which particular risk across your organization. So Lisa, good discussion around having bias toward action. How do you recommend folks get started?
So with apologies to William Gibson, zero trust is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. There are a number of different approaches, and one that I'm seeing really take off is to start by not trying to go all the way to zero trust at one go. Move to the cloud-centric model. Leverage a secure access service edge approach. So shift your connectivity model from an exposed VPN with an open inbound listener that is a tempting target for attackers to something that's more cloud-based that can distribute traffic without that exposed attack surface. That will build the foundation to get to zero trust access. When you move to an outbound-only connection, something like the Zero Trust Exchange offers, you get a bunch of key architectural benefits immediately, even if you just replace your VPN gateways and make no changes to policy. We can eliminate that external attack surface. We can eliminate backhaul and hairpinning within the organization. and we can drastically improve visibility. So then you have visibility into the user activity and workflows that you maybe didn't have before. This now gives you a strong foundation for identifying priorities and building towards your larger strategic goals. And you can really apply Zero Trust one use case at a time, one user community at a time, one resource group at a time, rather than having to try to eat the elephant in one bite. So, Brian, what else would you say we need to do?
For me, I think I would also say just stop making investments in legacy technologies. I think you have an opportunity as you have renewals come up, revisit those decisions. I think some of the decisions we make as practitioners, we get handcuffed to those things. So really be critical about, are those solutions, are those technologies, are those capabilities meeting your current needs? Are those solutions effective? Are they achieving your business outcomes? And more importantly, are they directionally aligned with your current strategy? As we know, most businesses, sort of irrespective of what, vertical you're in, most folks are moving to public cloud. Most folks are going through transformation journeys. So making sure that the technology and the products and services that you have within your security portfolio are directionally aligned with that strategy, because they may not be. And the other big one that, I think we as practitioners, myself included, is overcoming the sunk cost fallacy. So considering, technical debt, and I think this is one of the ways in which practitioners really get stuck in these tech debt holes, is making sure that, those investments that we've made as part of our legacy portfolio, really reconsidering some of those investments and using that renewal time to potentially revisit some of those decisions.
Sure. So you're considering things like the CapEx invested in your appliances and your dedicated connections, but you might also be considering the OpEx of configuration, management, troubleshooting across multiple resources, multiple security products, multiple interfaces, multiple log formats.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for calling that out. That's a great observation.
The other challenge, though, is you really have to not boil the ocean. Otherwise, you will never start. So once you've identified some form of low-hanging fruit, understand how it fits into the larger plan, but really think carefully about a phased approach so you don't take on too much at once. You don't have to have every answer up front. You may need to do some form of application discovery. You may need to improve your user groupings within your identity and access management. So assess what you have, leverage the context and the controls you do have, and then also build from there.
Absolutely. It's important that we recognize as well, a lot of the capabilities and a lot of the technology that we have deployed supporting our security infrastructure and IT infrastructure, those solutions worked great a decade ago, but they aren't necessarily best suited for the modern threat landscape. So cloud, mobility, working from home. I think it's critically important that we recognize, I think to your point, Lisa, when you're in a hole, you need to stop digging and use these opportunities to reevaluate your infrastructure and architecture.
Sure. Don't just keep trying to stretch your existing network-centric controls into today's cloud and mobile use cases where they don't serve well. The question to ask is, if you were designing a solution from scratch to meet your needs, not just today, but in the future, would you use yesterday's technology? Often you can expand into a more modern approach, and that can simplify this transformation journey. So you have a bias towards action. You've gotten a quick win. How do you keep the momentum going? How do we transition from tactical to strategic? Brian, what do you think here?
Yeah, this is a tough one. And I think something that we need to be very thoughtful and very disciplined as far as the strategy. And I think that there are very different approaches. As you mentioned, the tactical, sort of the, now to within, whatever that time frame for your organization is, 12 months for most organizations. But I think that strategy is very different than your strategic approach, which may be 24 to 36 months out. So I think that they're sort of very different plans. And obviously, as you start to get out into the 24 to 36 month view in that window, it's more opaque and it's a little bit more vague. But I think having that synergy between your tactical plans and your strategic plans is critically important. And I think that it definitely helps when it comes to execution. So what I would say is, again, quantify risk and prioritize accordingly. So whatever the things that you've identified in your organization that bring the most security risk or business risk or risk to your intellectual property, whatever your particular use case is, making sure that you're prioritizing those use cases and start there. And then making sure that you're working across the various stakeholders within your organization to really flesh out those particular use cases. What are the drivers? What are the various urgencies? And really getting disciplined about stack ranking those priorities and really focusing your execution on those particular outcomes. I would also say it's critically important to work with the stakeholders to understand what their concerns are, or potentially even some of the concerns that may not be on their radar. So you may have a population of users that may not necessarily understand some of the risks. We often see this with some of the legal teams or some of the compliance teams and so on. So just being very thoughtful about how you approach this. And then also really just being very open with communication about some of the, the current state architecture and some of the benefits of this transformation, really sharing and being a champion to really advocate for why this change is meaningful and why it will ultimately buy down risk within your organization. So I think having a compelling story, being able to effectively communicate what those challenges are, and also, frankly, what the benefits of the transformation are, will ultimately help get buy-in, and will also help to shape that picture of how you transform from sort of a very tactical project-based approach to thinking about security and zero trust in more of a strategic lens.
Sure, and that ties back to your point earlier about starting with why. It's a lot easier to evolve towards a zero trust strategic overall initiative if you've got buy-in and people understand what you're going to get out of it. The other piece of it too is if we do tackle one use case at a time, if we break it down into manageable phases, then we can recognize that each use case might require differing levels of control, might involve different levels of context. So at the larger picture, you can leverage the tools you already have, but you can also identify gaps in your ecosystem. You might be fully prepared for some use cases. You might need more information for others, and that's okay. You can do them serially or in parallel, depending on your urgency and your resources. You can really apply that crawl, walk, run methodology.
I love that one, Lisa. That's one of the favorites. I always reference crawl, walk, run in that exact order. So the other thing that I would say is you don't have to do it alone. I think recognize that there are opportunities for you to potentially bring in professional services or even potentially staff augmentation to help with some of these objectives. The interesting part about Zero Trust Journeys is you may not necessarily have the expertise on your particular team to really execute on some of these, and that's okay. Making sure that you recognize that up front and bringing in the necessary help, bringing in an expert, bringing in a MSSP or other provider to potentially help with some of those services and the delivery of those services. The last part I would close with is one of the things that I've personally seen a lot of value in is building a mutual delivery plan or an MDP. So this, emphasis on the mutual part of that word is it's an agreed upon plan between your organization and whatever particular vendor you may be working with, but to really have line of sight onto what success looks like. Where are the goalposts? What are the things that we need to accomplish as part of this plan, as part of this deployment that will get this across the finish line, and being very transparent about what those goals are, what those objectives are, so that everyone at the end of the day is marching towards the same plan.
Right, and this way each step can be self-contained, but it can still work towards the larger goal. So instead of multiple independent or uncoordinated projects, you can build momentum along the way. We have a manufacturing customer that did exactly that. They were extending Zero Trust to their B2B users, partners, suppliers, even contractors, and they were doing it for one use case. When other stakeholders saw the benefits of that solution, everybody wanted to jump in. I was talking with the CISO. He actually presented at our Zenith Live conference a couple years running to talk about how they did this. And it kind of felt like he was a victim of his own success. He had to figure out how to accelerate his deployment to accommodate the need. So Brian, you want to kick off our summary for us?
Absolutely, Lisa. Thank you so much. So, wow, we have covered a lot of ground in a relatively short period of time. So thank you for the partnership on this. And to recap, for Zero Trust adoption best practices, we want to have a bias towards action. So recognizing that the world has changed, public cloud and work from home have changed the attack surface, really avoiding analysis paralysis and having that strong bias to take action, recognizing that you are on fire. Some of the legacy controls that you have in your tech stack may just be tech debt and not necessarily having the security efficacy that you need. Really being focused on doing versus overthinking and falling in the trap of the analysis paralysis. And as Lisa mentioned, really getting some quick wins, come out of the gates strong, really focus on a couple of use cases that are really impactful and demonstrating that you can get some quick wins, build confidence within your team.
Absolutely. So once you've decided to go forward, how to take the first step is to recognize that it doesn't have to be monolithic. You don't have to solve the entire problem at once. You can break it down, identify pain points, identify risk points, identify cost points, and really focus on those. And as you do that, look for opportunities to move away from legacy controls that may be holding you back, as Brian said. Really look for a design that takes you into the future, where you can solve multiple problems in a way that builds towards a much larger strategic goal.
And lastly, expand strategically. So trying to make that transition from a tactical approach to a strategic approach. So prioritize using risk. Let risk be the compass heading for you. Let that drive your decision-making process. Working towards a defined end state. And that's really where the strategy part of this comes into play is what does success look like? What does your end state look like? If you don't know that, how can you start building a solution that ultimately is synergistic with that particular end state? And then just focusing on the crawl, walk, run piece of this is just recognizing, as Lisa mentioned, you don't have to boil the ocean. Start small, continue to build momentum, continue to build confidence. And lastly, get help. This is a team sport. You may not have some of the subject matter expertise, and that's okay. There are obviously professional services and staff augmentation and vendors that would be more than happy to help execute this journey with you, and just being able to bring all of those stakeholders to the team and execute accordingly.
And speaking of team sport, if you're interested in continuing this conversation and digging deeper into your use cases and your priorities, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to apply some of these principles in your environment.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Lisa. This was a great discussion. Really enjoyed it, and I appreciate the partnership.
Thank you, Brian. It's always fun to collaborate with you. Have a great one.
Cheers.